Golden Coast Resort, California. A wedding that cost $500,000. I sat in the dark of my car watching the guests arrive, listening to the ocean crash against the cliffs that would soon echo with my brother's ruin. My name is Rebecca Holt. To my family, I was the failure the invisible sister invited only to be mocked. To the FBI agents waiting in the lobby, I was the owner. They thought today was a coronation for their golden son. But I was holding the receipts that proved he didn't build this empire, he stole it from me. And the audit was about to begin. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. If you asked anyone standing in the valet line of the Golden Coast Resort what was happening today, they'd tell you it was the social event of the season. They would point to the imported orchids cascading down the marble entryway, the string quartet playing softly near the fountain, and the fleet of luxury sedans depositing guests who smelled like old money and new ambition. They would tell you it was a wedding, a union of two beautiful, successful people, a celebration of love. But I sat in my unremarkable sedan, the engine ticking as it cooled, watching the arrivals like a predator watches a herd from the tall grass, and I knew the truth. My family thought today was my brother Ethan's coronation. It was actually his audit. The invitation in my purse was heavy printed on cardstock, thick enough to shingle a roof embossed with gold leaf that probably cost more than my first car. Ethan Holt and Sloan Miller. It looked perfect. It looked expensive. But I wasn't looking at the calligraphy. I was looking at the structure of the lie that held it all up. To understand why I was sitting in a parking lot instead of drinking champagne, and why I was about to dismantle my own family's happiness with the precision of a surgeon, you have to understand the Holt family economy. In my house, love wasn't an emotion. It was an investment strategy, and my parents expected returns. I was never the favorite. I was the reliable one. In the lexicon of Diane and Michael Holt, reliable was not a compliment. Reliable is what you call a Honda Civic that you don't bother to wash because you know it will start every morning regardless of how you treat it. Ethan, on the other hand, was the Aston Martin. He was the golden son, the one my mother Diane showed off at country club luncheons, the one whose participation trophies were framed while my honor roll certificates were filed away in a drawer. My father Michael was a passive participant in this dynamic, a man who had long ago decided that keeping the peace with my mother was more important than parenting his daughter with any genuine affection. He backed her plays, nodded at her critiques, and treated my existence as a clerical error he was too polite to correct. I left home the day I turned 18. I didn't run away screaming. I just packed a bag and removed myself from the ledger. I realized early on that if I stayed, I would spend my life serving as the backdrop for Ethan's brilliance. I would be the drab curtain against which his colors looked brighter. So I disappeared into the grind. I didn't have their charm, and I didn't have their financial backing, but I had something they lacked: an absolute terrifying capacity for invisible labor. I worked 3 jobs, put myself through business school at night, and started a logistics consulting firm from a laptop I bought at a pawn shop. That firm grew. It didn't just grow. It devoured the competition. Over the last decade, I acquired mid-sized logistics companies, streamlined them, and folded them into a holding company I named Veritas Holdings. And here's the secret that I kept locked in a safe deposit box in my soul. I am Veritas. I own 51% of the controlling stock. I am the majority shareholder of the parent company that employs over 3,000 people, including my brother. I never told them, not once. When the money started coming in, when I bought my first house, when I started making 7 figures, I kept my mouth shut. Why? It wasn't just paranoia, it was a value choice. If I told Diane, she would have pivoted instantly, claiming my success was due to her strict upbringing. If I told my father, he would have asked for a loan. And if I told Ethan, he would have used me as a ladder. I didn't want their respect if it came with a price tag. I wanted to know definitively who loved Rebecca the person, not Rebecca the ATM. The answer, unfortunately, had been silence. Ethan had been hired at one of my subsidiary companies, Apex Global, 4 years ago. He didn't know I owned it. He was hired by a VP who thought he had executive presence, which is corporate speak for being a tall, handsome white man who can confidently deliver a PowerPoint presentation he didn't write. I watched him from the shadows of the board reports. I saw him climb the ranks not through innovation, but through charm and the aggressive claiming of credit for other people's work. I let it happen because I wanted to see if he would grow into the role. I wanted to believe that given a chance, the brother I once shared a playroom with would become the man my parents insisted he was. Instead, he became a monster in a bespoke suit. The inciting incident for my presence in this parking lot wasn't the invitation. It was the text message I received 3 hours ago. I was already dressed, staring at myself in the mirror, wearing a navy blue dress that was elegant but understated armor for the social battlefield. My phone buzzed. It was Ethan. "Hey Beck, Mom's really stressed about today. Everything has to be perfect for Sloan. Honestly, it might be better if you don't come. We don't want any drama or awkward vibes. I'm sure you get it. We'll catch up after the honeymoon." He uninvited me to his own wedding via text message on the morning of the ceremony. He didn't say, "I hate you." He said, "I'm sure you get it," which is the language of a coward who assumes you are already compliant. He assumed I would do what I always did, fade away to keep the peace. He assumed reliable Rebecca would take the hit, stay home, and send a gift anyway. He was wrong. I didn't come here to beg for a seat at the table. I didn't come to make a scene, scream at the bride, or throw cake. I came because in the process of reviewing the quarterly audits for Apex Global last week, work I do personally because I trust no one, I found anomalies, discrepancies, money bleeding out of the accounts receivable department in patterns that looked less like accounting errors and more like embezzlement. And when I pulled the metadata on the approvals, the digital fingerprints didn't belong to a hacker in a basement. They belonged to Executive Vice President Ethan Holt. I put the car in park and killed the engine. The silence inside the cabin was heavy. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. I didn't look like a sister mourning a relationship. I looked like a CEO preparing for a hostile takeover. I grabbed my clutch, which contained my phone, a cracked older model I used around them to maintain the illusion of mediocrity, and a slim encrypted flash drive. Stepping out of the car, the coastal air hit me thick with salt and jasmine. The venue was staggering. The Golden Coast Resort was the kind of place where the grass looked like it had been manicured with tweezers. To my left, a staff member was arranging a welcome sign made of frosted glass and driftwood. Guests were flowing past it, offering their names to a harried coordinator holding a clipboard. I walked up to the periphery, blending in. I wasn't technically on the list anymore, not if Ethan had his way, but I knew how these things worked. Security was looking for crashers in jeans, not a woman in a $1,000 dress who walked with the entitlement of ownership. As I neared the welcome station, I paused, feigning interest in a floral arrangement while I listened to the coordinator. She was arguing softly with a delivery driver who was unloading crates of high-end wine and spirits. "The invoice isn't in the binder," the coordinator hissed, trying to keep her voice down. "Mr. Holt said this was prepaid." "Look, lady," the driver said, tapping a digital pad. "It's billed to the corporate account, net 30 terms. I just need a signature." My ears perked up. Corporate account. This was a personal wedding. There shouldn't be any corporate accounts involved unless Ethan was paying through a business he owned, which he didn't. I stepped closer, adjusting my earring, getting within reading distance of the driver's manifest. The logo on his shirt said, Redstone Logistics. I knew that name. Redstone was a vendor my company used for high-volume freight. They were a legitimate third-party contractor. Why were they delivering wedding alcohol? I glanced at the clipboard the driver was holding out. The invoice header was visible for a split second before the coordinator snatched it to sign. Bill, to Apex Global, Client Development, AXT number 8842, Ref E. Holt, Q3 Seminar. The air left my lungs in a sharp, silent hiss. He wasn't just embezzling cash. He was expensing the wedding. He was laundering his vanity project through the company I built, classifying his nuptials as a Q3 seminar, and billing the alcohol to client development. It was so brazen, so breathtakingly arrogant that I almost laughed. Ethan didn't just think he was above the rules. He thought the rules were raw materials he could reshape to build his own altar. He was stealing from me to pay for the party where he intended to exclude me. I looked up at the resort at the sprawling verandas and the guests laughing with drinks in their hands. Every glass of champagne was stolen. Every flower arrangement was fraud. The band warming up in the distance was likely being paid for by the marketing budget. A younger version of me might have cried. A younger version of me might have felt the sting of exclusion and retreated to the safety of my apartment. But that version of Rebecca was dead. She died the moment I saw that invoice. I walked past the coordinator, ignoring her confused glance, as she tried to locate my name on the seating chart I knew had been altered. I didn't stop. I walked straight into the venue, my heels clicking rhythmically on the paved stone. "You think this is about a wedding?" I whispered to myself, the words barely audible over the sound of the ocean. "It's actually about a funeral." I stepped through the archway and into the reception garden. The first lie I walked into was that this wedding was paid for by hard work. My parents were beaming near the entrance, shaking hands, accepting praise for raising such a successful son. They looked at the luxury around them and saw a reflection of their own status. I looked at it and saw evidence. I tightened my grip on my clutch. The audit was officially open. The path to the reception area was a gauntlet of social judgment lined with people who measured human worth by the cut of a lapel. I navigated through the crowd, keeping my head high, but before I could reach the safety of the perimeter, I was intercepted. My parents didn't greet me. They blocked me. They moved with the synchronized hostility of bouncers guarding a VIP section, their smiles tight and practiced. My mother, Diane, wore a silver gown that shimmered like fish scales. She scanned me from head to toe, her eyes lingering on my off-the-rack dress. It was a nice dress, professional and clean, but in this arena, it was an admission of defeat. "Rebecca," she said, the word tasting like a lemon seed she was trying to spit out. "We didn't think you were coming. Ethan said you were busy." "I made time," I said, keeping my voice neutral. Mom reached out, smoothing a non-existent wrinkle on my shoulder. "Well, you look comfortable. It's brave of you to wear that color. It really highlights your practicality." There it was, the smile knife. A compliment wrapped around an insult so tightly you couldn't bleed without looking unreasonable. My father, Michael, stood beside her, swirling a glass of scotch. He looked at me with a vague, watery disappointment, as if I were a stock that had underperformed for 28 consecutive quarters. "Still doing that shipping thing?" he asked, not waiting for an answer. Ethan was telling us about the logistics of this wedding. Complex stuff. Millions of moving parts. Makes your little delivery business seem quaint, doesn't it? "It's a logistics consulting firm, Dad." I said the correction automatic and ignored. "And business is good." "I'm sure it pays the rent," he said dismissively, turning his attention back to the crowd. "But look at this, Rebecca. Look at what your brother has built. This is the big leagues." I followed his gaze. Ethan had arrived. He stepped onto the patio like a deity descending from Olympus, wearing a tuxedo that fit him so perfectly it looked like it had been grown in a lab. He was laughing, shaking hands, radiating that specific brand of executive charisma that convinces people to thank you for robbing them. The crowd parted for him. My parents glowed. They didn't just look at him with love. They looked at him with relief. He was their proof. He was the evidence that their genetics were superior, that their parenting was flawless. I was just the control group that failed. Ethan spotted me. For a fraction of a second, his smile faltered, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face like static on a screen. But he was a professional. He recovered instantly, steering his new bride Sloane toward us. Sloane looked beautiful, terrified, and expensive. "Beck!" Ethan boomed. His voice pitched for an audience. He pulled me into a one-armed hug that felt more like a restraint technique. "You made it. I thought you were swamped with whatever it is you're figuring out these days." He released me and turned to the circle of admirers forming around us. Everyone, this is my little sister Rebecca. She's still finding her footing in the business world, but she's got spirit." The circle chuckled. It was a patronizing, pitying sound. "Ethan," I said, my voice steady, "the venue is impressive." "It's about vision, Beck," he said, winking at Dad. "You have to spend money to make money, or in this case, to make memories. Right, Pop?" "That's my boy," Dad beamed. I felt a physical sickness in my gut. He was quoting business platitudes while standing in a crime scene of his own making. I needed air. I needed to get away from the suffocating weight of their pride. "I'm going to get some water," I muttered, stepping away. I moved toward the hydration station, an elaborate setup with crystal dispensers filled with fruit-infused water. I needed a moment to reset, to remind myself that I wasn't the failure they described. I was the one signing their checks. I poured a glass of water, my hand trembling slightly. "Careful there, clumsy." I turned. Ethan had followed me. He was standing too close, his public smile gone, replaced by the sneer I remembered from our childhood. He held a heavy crystal tumbler of whiskey. "I told you not to come," he said, his voice a low hiss. "Sloane doesn't need your dark cloud hovering over her day. You ruin the aesthetic, Beck. You always have." "I'm just here to see the family, Ethan," I lied. "You're here to look pathetic so Mom and Dad pity you," he spat. "Well, let's give them a show." He moved to lean against the table, and then with a motion that was technically plausible as an accident, but spiritually undeniably deliberate, he jerked his arm. The contents of his tumbler, amber liquid and ice, didn't hit the floor. He swept his arm outward, colliding with the hand I was using to hold my water glass. The impact sent my glass tipping backward. Ice-cold water drenched the front of my navy dress, soaking the fabric instantly. It clung to my skin, dark and heavy, making me look like a drowned rat. "Oh!" Ethan shouted, stepping back, his hands raised in mock surrender. "Beck, watch what you're doing. You're spilling everywhere." The conversation nearby stopped. Heads turned. 50 people looked at me. I stood there, water dripping from my hem, onto the limestone pavers, humiliation burning my face. "God, Rebecca." Mom sighed, appearing from the crowd. She didn't offer a napkin. She offered a critique. "Always a mess. Can't you go one day without needing attention?" I didn't. I started, but the laughter cut me off. It wasn't raucous laughter. It was polite cocktail party laughter. The sound of people relieved that the disaster wasn't them. Dad shook his head, chuckling along with the other men. "That's Rebecca for you. Grace of a newborn colt." Ethan stood there looking at me with dead eyes, wiping a single drop of water from his tuxedo sleeve. He had engineered this. He wanted me wet, cold, and embarrassed. He wanted to remind me of the hierarchy. In that moment, standing in a puddle of my own humiliation, clarity washed over me. I realized they weren't mistaken about me. They weren't waiting for me to prove myself. They were committed to this version of me. They needed me to be the failure so Ethan could be the success. My incompetence was the foundation of their family myth. I had a choice. I could scream. I could throw the empty glass at his head and scream that I owned the company that paid for his suit. I could burn it all down right now. But that's what dramatic Rebecca would do. That's what the unstable sister would do. I took a deep breath. I set the glass down gently on the table. I smoothed the wet fabric of my dress. "It's just water," I said, my voice barely above a whisper but firm. "I'll dry off." I turned and walked away. I didn't run. I walked with a straight spine, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me cry. I headed toward the restrooms located near the service entrance. As I rounded the corner away from the guests, the facade dropped. My hands shook. I leaned against the cool stucco wall of the service corridor, breathing hard. I needed to leave. I should just leave. Bzzzt. My phone vibrated in my clutch. I pulled it out. It was Jordan, my CFO, and the only person in the world who knew the full scope of my life. "Jordan, I'm deep in the server logs. It's worse than we thought." The consulting fees to the shell companies, they were approved by Ethan's login at 300 a.m. last night. He's draining the operating capital to pay for the emergency wedding costs. Also check the vendor list I just emailed you. Recognize the name Azure Events. I switched to my email. Azure Events. It was the name of the wedding planning company running today's show. I heard voices around the corner coming from the service alcove. I froze. I don't care what the contract says, a male voice laughed. It was Ethan. He must have slipped away while everyone was laughing at me. Just put it under client retention. The auditors are idiots. They see client retention and they glaze over. Nobody checks the line items. It's a $50,000 florist bill, Ethan, another voice replied. A man's voice, slurred, arrogant. That's a lot of retention. The company made $10 million last quarter, Ethan scoffed. My sister's little operation. It's a cash cow. I'm just milking it. Besides, the owner is some shadow board. Nobody knows who it is. I run the floor. I approve the spend. It's free money, man. My blood ran cold. He wasn't just stealing. He was mocking the idiot auditors. He was mocking me. I waited for them to leave, counting the seconds. When the coast was clear, I moved deeper into the service area. I needed to find the planner. I needed physical proof to match the digital trail Jordan was building. I found the Azure Events station near the kitchen. The head planner, a woman with a headset and a terrified expression, was arguing with a catering manager. A binder lay open on her table. I walked up, projecting the authority I usually hid. Excuse me, I said. I'm with the bridal party. Ethan asked me to check the payment status for the lighting vendor. The planner looked up flustered. Oh, sure. It's all been handled. Mr. Holt gave us the corporate card this morning for the overages. Great, I said. He just wanted to make sure the receipt went to the right email. Can I just verify the last 4 digits? She hesitated, then flipped a page. It's the chaotic day right here. She pointed to a credit card authorization form. There it was. The Corporate American Express for Apex Global. The card issued to the CEO office. The card that was supposed to be in the safe at headquarters. Ethan must have lifted the numbers or requested a duplicate. And the signature at the bottom, it wasn't his. It was a forgery of the authorized signatory. My signature. He had forged my name to steal my money, to humiliate me. I snapped a picture of the page with my phone before she could pull it away. Perfect, I said. Thanks. I walked back toward the party, my wet dress forgotten. I wasn't a sister anymore. I was a reaper. As I merged back into the periphery of the reception, I felt a hand on my arm. I flinched, ready to fight, but I looked down into the warm, wrinkled face of Mrs. Alvarez. She was my high school history teacher and my neighbor for 10 years. She was wearing a simple Sunday dress, holding a tray of empty glasses. She wasn't a guest. She was working. Retired teachers don't make enough to retire in this town. Rebecca, she whispered, her eyes scanning my wet dress. I saw what happened. I saw him splash you. It was an accident, Mrs. A, I said automatically. It was no accident, she said, her grip tightening on my arm. That boy has been kicking sand in your face since he was 6 years old, and your parents have been handing him the shovel. She looked at me, her eyes fierce and knowing. You don't need their permission to exist, Mija. You built yourself without them. Don't let them make you feel small in a room you could probably buy. I stared at her. She didn't know I owned the company. She just knew me. She saw the strength I tried so hard to hide. The right kind of strength, she said, squeezing my arm, is quiet. Until it isn't, you pick your moment. She patted my arm and moved back into the crowd to bus tables. Her words settled in my chest like an anchor. You could probably buy the room. I looked around the wedding. The midpoint twist hit me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just a party funded by theft. The wedding was the theft. Every centerpiece was a falsified invoice. The DJ booth was a kickback. The photographer was a ghost employee on the payroll. The entire event was a money laundering operation, painted white and covered in tulle. Ethan hadn't just dipped into the till. He had constructed this entire day out of criminal acts. The love story slideshow screen flickered to life near the stage. A picture of Ethan and Sloane appeared glowing with artificial perfection. I looked at the stage. I looked at the microphone stand waiting for the toasts. I could leave. I could go home, call the lawyers, and have him arrested on Monday. It would be clean. It would be private. But then I looked at my parents laughing with the guests selling the lie of the golden sun. I looked at Ethan, smug and untouchable, the man who forged my signature and spilled water on me because he thought I was nothing. If I did this privately, they would spin it. They would tell the world I was jealous that I framed him, that I was the vindictive sister destroying the family. They would control the narrative. No. The crime was public. The execution had to be public. I needed to strip the insulation from the wire. I needed to show them exactly who was paying for the champagne they were drinking. I texted Jordan one word, ready. Then I texted him again. Send the lockout command to the server in 20 minutes. I put my phone away. I checked my reflection in a window. The water stain was still there, dark and ugly. I didn't try to hide it anymore. It was part of the uniform. I walked toward the head table. It was time to give a toast. The reception hall was a masterclass in manufactured elegance. Chandeliers dripped crystals like frozen tears, and the tables were set with enough silverware to ransom a small country. My mother, in her infinite wisdom and cruelty, had seated me at table 19. It was the exile table positioned directly next to the swinging kitchen doors and the emergency exit. I was seated with a distant cousin who collected ferret figurines and a former neighbor who had clearly been invited by mistake. From this vantage point, I was invisible. I was a dark smudge on the pristine canvas of Ethan's triumph. The speeches began. The best man. A college buddy of Ethan's who looked like he'd been manufactured in a fraternity cloning facility told a story about a trip to Vegas that skirted the edges of legality. The maid of honor cried while talking about how Sloane tamed Ethan. The room applauded, glasses clinked. My parents held hands looking at their son with an adoration that bordered on religious worship. I sat still, my hand resting on the cool metal of the flash drive in my pocket. I wasn't eating the filet mignon, I was watching the AV technician. He was a young guy, maybe 22, managing the laptop that drove the massive projection screen behind the head table. Currently, it was cycling through a slideshow titled Ethan and Sloane, A Love Story. Photos of them on yachts in Paris at vineyards. The maid of honor finished wiping mascara from her cheek. The DJ, a man with a radio voice and a tuxedo that was slightly too shiny, took the microphone. And now, he boomed, we'd like to open the floor for a few words from the groom's family. My father stood up, adjusting his tie. This was the script. Dad would give a toast about hard work and legacy, Mom would weep, and Ethan would look humble. I stood up at the same time. I didn't rush. I didn't run. I walked with the steady, inexorable pace of a rising tide. I walked past table 12, past table 5, past the head table. My father saw me coming and froze, his mouth half open. My mother's eyes widened, her hand flying to her throat. They expected unstable Rebecca. They expected a scene. They didn't expect the calm, terrifying resolve radiating off me. I reached the DJ booth before my father could leave his table. I looked the DJ in the eye. I'm the sister, I said, my voice low and authoritative. I have a special presentation for the couple. It's a surprise. The DJ, trained to defer to family, and assuming this was part of the paid programming, smiled and handed me the microphone. He gestured to the AV guy. Plug her in, kid. I handed the flash drive to the technician. File name is The Truth, I said softly. Autoplay. He plugged it in. I stepped to the center of the dance floor, the microphone heavy in my hand. The room went silent. The clinking of silverware stopped. Ethan stared at me, his face flushing a dangerous shade of red. He started to stand up. Sit down, Ethan, I said. I didn't yell it. I said it with the casual command of someone who trains dogs. He paused, confused by the tone. He sat. For those who don't know me, I began, my voice clear and steady over the high-end speakers. I'm Rebecca, Ethan's sister. A smattering of polite, confused applause. I wanted to come up here and talk about protection, I said, adopting a warm, almost nostalgic tone. Growing up, Ethan was always the one who looked out for the big picture. He knew what he wanted, and he knew how to get it. My parents always said Ethan had a vision that the rest of us couldn't see. And looking around this room tonight, looking at this incredible display of wealth and success, I realized they were right. I saw my parents relax slightly. Shoulders dropped. They thought I was capitulating. They thought I was finally playing my role, the adoring lesser sibling paying tribute to the king. Ethan told me earlier today that this wedding cost nearly $500,000. I continued pacing slowly. He told everyone that it was the result of his hard work as an executive vice president. And that's true. It takes a lot of work to move that kind of money around. I turned to the screen. Can we dim the lights, please? The lights went down. The screen, which had been showing a photo of Ethan and Sloane kissing under a sunset, flickered. I wanted to show you all exactly what it takes to build a life like this. The slide changed. It wasn't a photo of the couple. It was a high-resolution scan of a vendor contract. Vendor Azure Events, amount $125,000. Bill to Apex Global Logistics, project code Q3 retainer. A ripple of confusion went through the room. People squinted. This is the invoice for tonight's event planning. I narrated, my voice pleasant, like I was explaining a vacation photo. As you can see, it wasn't paid for by Ethan Holt. It was paid for by Apex Global Logistics, billed under a retainer for a project that doesn't exist. Ethan shot out of his chair. Turn it off, he screamed. What the hell are you doing? Turn it off! Sit down! I snapped, the pleasantness vanishing instantly. My voice cracked like a whip. I have the floor. I clicked the clicker I'd taken from the AV kid. The slide changed again. Invoice Redstone Liquors, amount $42,000. Approval signature. Rebecca Holt forged. This is the bill for the champagne you're all drinking, I said. $42,000. Approved by a signature that looks like mine but isn't. That's called forgery. It's a felony. The room was deathly quiet now. The silence wasn't awkward anymore. It was terrified. Sloane was staring at the screen, her face draining of color. My parents looked like they were having simultaneous strokes. Ethan charged toward the stage. She's lying. She's drunk. Security, get her out of here. He lunged for me, but he didn't make it. Two men in dark suits stepped out from the shadows near the kitchen. They weren't resort security. They were private contractors I had brought with me. They stepped in front of Ethan, blocking his path with professional indifference. I'm not lying, Ethan, I said, holding my ground. And I'm not drunk. I'm auditing you. Who do you think you are? Ethan shouted, struggling against the suit who held him back by the chest. You're nobody. You work in a warehouse. You think anyone believes you. You're just a jealous, pathetic little girl. I looked at him. I looked at the crowd. I took a breath. That's the other lie, I said into the mic. Ethan told you I'm figuring things out. He told you I'm associated with the industry. I clicked the slide again. The screen displayed a certificate of incorporation and a shareholder disclosure form. Entity, Veritas Holdings. Primary shareholder, Rebecca Holt. 51% subsidiaries, Apex Global Logistics, North Star Freight, Holt Mercer Group. I don't work in a warehouse, I said. I own Veritas Holdings. I own Apex Global. I am the chairman of the board. And Ethan, you don't work for a faceless corporation. You work for me. The gasp that went through the room was physical. It sucked the air out of the space. My mother stood up, her hand shaking violently. Rebecca, what is this? This is the truth, Mom, I said. I bought the company 5 years ago. I kept it anonymous because I didn't want this family to do exactly what Ethan has done, treat my work like a personal piggy bank. I turned back to Ethan. He had stopped struggling. He was staring at the screen, his mouth working, no sound coming out. The realization was hitting him. The idiot auditors, he mocked. That was me. The shadow board, me. I didn't come here to ruin a wedding, I said. I came to stop a theft. But it's not just the money, Ethan. I clicked the remote one more time. The screen filled with a side-by-side comparison. On the left was a time-stamped email from 4 years ago sent from my personal account to Ethan. It contained a PDF attached proprietary logistics algorithm, Project Blue. On the right was Ethan's employment application to Apex Global dated 2 weeks later. The centerpiece of his application was Project Blue. He had stripped my name off the header and put his own. "You didn't just steal the money for the party," I said, my voice trembling with the first real emotion I'd let slip. "You stole my work to get the job in the first place. You used my mind to climb a ladder, and then you kicked me in the face when you got to the top." I looked at the guests. Every promotion he got was based on strategy I wrote. Every bonus he earned was based on efficiency models I built. He is a fraud. He has been a fraud since day one. Ethan looked wild now. Panic had set in. He turned to the crowd, his arms spread wide. "She's crazy. She's always been jealous of me. Look at her. She's mentally unstable. Mom, tell them, Dad." My father stood there gray-faced. He looked at the screen, then at Ethan, then at me. He saw the numbers. He was a weak man, but he understood math. He knew this wasn't a tantrum. It was a dossier. He sat back down, putting his head in his hands. "Dad," Ethan screamed. "Don't listen to her." "It's over, Ethan," I said. I looked toward the back of the room. The double doors opened. 3 people walked in. One was Jordan, my general counsel. The other 2 wore windbreakers with FBI printed on the back in yellow block letters. The federal agents didn't run. They didn't draw weapons. They walked with the heavy board purpose of people who have a warrant and plenty of time. "Because of the interstate nature of the wire fraud," I said into the microphone, "and the amount exceeding $100,000, this isn't a family dispute. It's a federal investigation. Jordan filed the evidence package this morning." Ethan saw the agents. He stumbled back, knocking over a chair. He looked at Sloane. "Baby, I can explain. It's a misunderstanding. It's an accounting error." Sloane stood up. She looked at the screen where the invoices for her dream wedding were displayed like mugshots. She looked at the husband who had promised her the world and delivered her a felony indictment. She didn't scream. She just took off her ring, set it on the table, and walked away toward the exit, passing the FBI agents without looking back. The agents reached the stage. Ethan tried to pull away, but they spun him around. The click-click of handcuffs was audible over the sound system because I hadn't lowered the mic. "Ethan Holt," one agent said, "you're under arrest for wire fraud, embezzlement, and identity theft." As they began to march him out, he thrashed, turning his head to look at me. His face was a mask of pure hatred. "You bitch! You ruined everything! You ruined my life!" I watched him go. I felt a strange, hollow lightness in my chest. The weight of 20 years of silence was gone. The room was frozen. The guests were statues. The only sound was the hum of the projector fan. I looked at my parents. They were shrunken small figures at a table full of cold food. They had spent their lives worshipping a golden idol, and I had just melted it down to show them it was painted lead. I raised the microphone to my lips one last time. "You didn't build this life, Ethan," I said to his retreating back. "You build it." I dropped the microphone. It hit the floor with a heavy thud that echoed like a gavel. I walked off the stage, past the stunned silence of the crowd, past the ruin of the wedding cake, and headed for the door. I didn't look back. The doors swung shut behind the FBI agents, sealing the ballroom off from the ugly reality of the parking lot arrests. Inside, the air was brittle. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the stunned, suffocating vacuum of a bomb site immediately after detonation. The guests, hundreds of them, sat frozen in their expensive chairs, staring at their half-eaten entrees as if the food itself had been indicted. I stood at the bottom of the stage stairs, my hands trembling slightly now that the adrenaline was receding. I expected the shock to fade into murmurs. Instead, it curdled into immediate venomous denial. My mother descended upon me not with concern for her son's legal peril, but with the fury of a woman whose social currency had just been devalued to zero. She marched across the dance floor, her silver gown rustling aggressively, her face a mask of contorted rage. "How could you?" she hissed, stopping inches from my face. Her voice was low, vibrating with a hatred I had never seen so nakedly displayed. "How could you do this to us, to your family?" "I didn't do this, Mom," I said, my voice hoarse. "Ethan did." "You did this publicly?" she shrieked, abandoning the whisper. Heads turned. "You could have handled this quietly. You could have come to us. You dragged us through the mud in front of everyone we know." "If I had come to you quietly," I countered, "you would have helped him bury it. You would have asked me to write it off as a family loan. You would have made me the accomplice." "He is your brother," she cried, tears finally spilling over tears of frustration, not grief. "We are your blood. You chose money over blood. I chose the truth over a felony," I said. "And it wasn't my money he stole, Mom. It was the livelihoods of 3,000 employees. He stole from pension funds. He stole from operations. He put good people at risk to pay for ice sculptures." My father finally shuffled up behind her. He wouldn't look me in the eye. He looked at the floor, at the walls, anywhere but at the daughter who had just outmaneuvered him. "We didn't know, Rebecca." He mumbled, his voice thick with the cowardice that had defined my childhood. "We had no idea he was managing the finances that way. You can't blame us for believing him." "You didn't know because you didn't want to know," I said, cutting him off. "You saw a 28-year-old man spending $500,000 on a party, and you didn't ask a single question about where the cash came from because the lie felt too good. You wanted the golden son so badly that you let him rob the bank to buy the crown." "You're cruel," my mother spat. "You've always been cold. You did this out of jealousy because he was happy and you're alone." "I am alone," I admitted, feeling the weight of the words. "But I'm not a thief. And tonight I'm the only one standing here with clean hands." I sidestepped them. I couldn't look at them anymore. The grief hit me then, sharp and sudden, not for the destruction of the family, but for the confirmation that there had never been a family to save. There was just a corporation of ego, and I had just dissolved the partnership. I walked toward the exit. In the lobby outside the double doors I found Sloane. She was sitting on a velvet bench staring at the marble floor. Her makeup was streaked, her posture collapsed. She looked like a marionette whose strings had been cut. She looked up as I approached. There was no anger in her eyes, just a vast, hollow confusion. "Is it true?" she whispered. "The invoices, the stealing, is all of it true?" I stopped. I could have twisted the knife. I could have told her she should have known better, that she was just another accessory he purchased. But looking at her, I realized she was just another victim of Ethan's distortion field. "You already know the answer, Sloane," I said gently. She closed her eyes and let out a shuddering breath. "He told me he had investments. He told me the company gave him a discretionary fund." "He lied," I said, "about the money, about the job, about who he was." "What happens now?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Now," I said, "the wedding is over. I'm sorry." I left her there and walked toward the front entrance. Jordan was waiting for me by the valet stand, his phone pressed to his ear. He looked up and nodded, ending the call. "It's done," Jordan said, his voice calm and surgical, a balm after the hysteria inside. "We've secured the accounts. The board has issued the termination notice effective immediately. The forensic team is locking down his office as we speak." "The vendors?" I asked. "I'm speaking with the venue manager now," Jordan said. "I told them Veritas Holdings will honor the contracts for the staff labor and the food costs to ensure the workers get paid. But we're clawing back the deposits on the extras. We aren't paying for the flowers or the band. That debt stays with Ethan personally." "Good," I said. "Make sure the hourly staff gets tipped out. I don't want the waiters paying for my brother's crimes." I looked back at the venue. The music had stopped. The lights were fully up, harsh and unforgiving. I saw Mrs. Alvarez standing near the coat check, holding her purse. She caught my eye and gave a small, firm nod. It wasn't a smile. It was a salute. She knew what it cost to burn down your own house to kill the termites. A young woman in a catering uniform walked past me carrying a tray of untouched champagne flutes. She paused. "Excuse me," she said tentatively. Are you the owner? The real owner?" "Yes," I said. "Thank you," she said quietly. "My cousin works in the warehouse at Apex. He told me about the hiring freeze. He was scared he was going to lose his job. If your brother was draining the accounts." "The accounts are safe," I told her. "Your cousin is safe. Tell him things are going to be different starting Monday." She smiled a genuine relieved smile and walked away. That was the moment the grief settled into something manageable. I had lost my parents. I had lost my brother. I had lost the fantasy of a normal life. But I had saved the company. I had protected the people who actually mattered, the ones who did the work, the ones who were reliable. Freedom, I realized as I stepped out into the cool night air, wasn't free. It cost everything you used to think you needed. But as I took a breath of salt air unpolluted by perfume and lies, I decided it was a price I was willing to pay. The fallout didn't happen all at once. It wasn't a movie where the credits roll the moment the handcuffs click. Real life is messier, slower, and filled with the kind of bureaucratic violence that grinds a person down inch by inch. In the weeks following the wedding, the dismantling of Ethan Holt was a matter of public record and private misery. He wasn't thrown into a dark cell immediately. He was thrown into the American legal system, which is arguably worse for a man whose entire identity is built on appearances. Ethan made bail, of course. My parents leveraged the equity in their house to cover it, a final desperate bet on a horse that had already broken its leg. But freedom was relative. He was fired for cause the morning after the wedding. The termination letter was delivered by courier to the apartment he could no longer afford. Because the fraud involved interstate wire transfers and exceeded statutory limits, the federal investigation froze his assets. His bank accounts were locked, his credit cards were dead plastic. The Audi he loved so much was repossessed in front of his neighbors, a scene that I'm sure made the community Facebook group buzz for days. He didn't go to prison immediately. He entered the purgatory of pre-trial motions, depositions, and plea bargain negotiations. But the true sentence had already been carried out. His reputation was scorched earth. In the logistics industry, trust is the only currency that matters, and Ethan was now known as the executive who stole from his own payroll to buy orchids. He was radioactive. His LinkedIn profile vanished. His friends, the ones who drank his scotch and laughed at his jokes, evaporated into the mist. He was left with nothing but his legal bills and the suffocating silence of a phone that never rang. My parents fared no better, though their punishment was psychological rather than legal. For 30 years, Diane and Michael Holt had curated a very specific narrative. They were the parents of the golden son. They were the architects of success. That story was the oxygen they breathed. When I exposed Ethan, I didn't just expose a crime, I popped the balloon. They lost the ability to walk into the country club and hold court. They lost the smug, knowing glances they used to exchange when other parents talked about their children's struggles. Now they were the parents of the felon. They were the people who hadn't noticed their son was a thief because they were too busy admiring his suit. They tried to see me one last time about a month after the wedding. They came to my office, the real office at the headquarters of Veritas Holdings. I didn't hide anymore. I didn't work from a laptop in a coffee shop to avoid questions. I sat in the corner office on the top floor, the one with the view of the harbor behind a desk that was wide enough to land a plane on. When my assistant showed them in, they looked smaller. The bluster was gone. My mother looked frail, her silver hair less perfectly coiffed. My father looked like a man who was shrinking inside his own clothes. They sat in the guest chairs, looking around the room, taking in the reality of what I had built without them. "Rebecca?" My mother started, her voice wavering. She didn't have the energy for the smile knife anymore. We just wanted to talk." "I'm listening," I said. I didn't offer them coffee. "Ethan is in a bad way," she said. "He's depressed. He's scared. The lawyers are talking about years, real years in prison. He committed real crimes, I said simply. He's your brother. She pleaded, tears welling up in her eyes. It was the last card she had to play, the trump card. Family is family, Rebecca. You don't destroy your own blood. You protect it, no matter what. I looked at them, really looked at them for the first time in my life without the filter of a child seeking approval. I saw two terrified people who had built a shrine to a lie and were now weeping in the rubble. You're right, I said. You protect family, but you didn't protect me. You let him use me. You let him mock me. You let him steal from the company that I built to support this family. You watched him splash water on me at his wedding and you laughed. My father flinched. We didn't know it was going to go this far. Family doesn't mean ownership, I said, my voice hard and final. It doesn't mean you get to cannibalize one child to feed the ego of the other. I am not a resource for you to mine. I am a person. And I am done being the collateral damage for Ethan's vanity. So that's it? My mother asked, a flash of her old anger sparking. You're just going to let him rot? You have all this money, all this power. You could fix this. I am fixing it, I said. I'm fixing the company. I'm fixing the culture he poisoned. And I'm fixing my life by removing the people who break it. I stood up. You should go. I have a board meeting. They left. They didn't slam the door. They just walked out looking old and defeated. They lost the story they used to dominate rooms, and without it, they were just ghosts haunting a building they didn't own. The rest of my recovery was public and transparent. I stopped hiding behind shell companies and anonymous trusts. I held a town hall meeting in the main warehouse of Apex Global. 3,000 employees stood on the concrete floor, forklift drivers, dispatchers, shift supervisors. These were the people Ethan had called idiots and overhead. I stood on a pallet crate with a microphone wearing jeans and a blazer. I told them everything. I told them about the embezzlement. I told them about the audit. And then I told them who I was. My name is Rebecca Holt, I said, my voice echoing off the high steel rafters. I founded this company 10 years ago. I stayed in the shadows because I thought it was safer. I was wrong. Transparency is the only safety. I announced the new initiatives immediately. We launched a scholarship fund for employees' children, the kind of legitimate support Ethan had pretended to care about. I implemented a whistleblower protection program with a direct line to the board of directors, ensuring that no manager could ever intimidate a worker into silence again. And I announced a profit-sharing model that would pay back every cent Ethan had drained directly into the pockets of the people who actually earned it. The applause wasn't polite golf claps. It was a roar. It was the sound of people realizing that for the first time, the person at the top actually saw them. It grounded my power in something real, not in status or luxury or the opinions of country club socialites, but in the American ideal of fairness. You build it, you keep it. You steal it, you lose it. A few nights later, I found the only closure that really mattered. I didn't find it in a courtroom or a boardroom. I found it in my car. I drove away from the city, away from the glass tower of Veritas Holdings, and away from the suburbs where my parents lived in their silent house. I drove out to the coast, but not to the resort. I went to a small roadside diner about 5 miles down the highway, a place with vinyl seats and coffee that tasted like burnt hazelnuts. It was late. The diner was mostly empty, just a few truckers and a couple of teenagers in a booth. I sat at the counter and ordered a slice of pie and a coffee. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. Hello? The voice was warm, familiar. Hi, Mrs. Alvarez, I said. It's Rebecca. Rebecca, she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. I was just thinking about you. How are you holding up, mija? I'm okay, I said, and for the first time in 20 years I meant it. I'm really okay. I wanted to say thank you for seeing me. I always saw you, she said, gentle. The world is just catching up. We talked for a while not about business or felonies or revenge. We talked about books. We talked about her garden. We talked about normal, boring things. It was the most luxurious conversation I had ever had. I hung up and looked out the window at the dark ocean crashing against the shore. I thought about Ethan. I thought about the wedding that was supposed to be his coronation. I thought about my parents and their desperate need for a winner. They had spent their entire lives trying to mold a champion out of clay and charisma. They had bet everything on the loud, the shiny, the aggressive. They thought strength looked like a tuxedo and a corner office obtained through nepotism. They never understood that real power is the ability to endure. It's the ability to work in the dark until the light is ready for you. I took a sip of the cheap coffee. It tasted better than the champagne at the wedding. I exhaled a long, slow breath that carried the last of the tension out of my body. The war was over. The silence was gone. They thought they raised a winner. Turns out they raised the person who would stop one. And so Rebecca finally found her peace, proving that sometimes the loudest victories happen in the quietest moments. If you enjoyed watching her reclaim her name, please consider subscribing for more stories of justice served. Let us know what you would have done in her position down below. We read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.